So actually, we didn't do a Parsha class this week, so maybe there's some Parsha stuff here. So we had to maybe lean in a little bit on the story, not just on the Kabbalah. We'll see. But in any case, you have the conclusion of the book of Genesis. So if it's the conclusion of the book, you have to say something significant about, in a way, the general idea of the book, and it's really a portion of transition, because yes, we've been talking about the book of the patriarchs, and that's Genesis. And we talked about the Shvatim, the tribes, so it's still a family of the patriarchs. And once you get to next week, once you get to the beginning of the book of Exodus, we are no longer a specific family. We're a family too, but we're also a nation. And that's very interesting. And next in the second book, for the first time, we're called Hine Am. We are called yes, and this, I'm drawing a blank, but Pharaoh tells his people, behold, there is a nation. And we're referred to as a nation for the first time in the book of Exodus, if I'm not mistaken. Just get confirmation on that. Don't want to mislead anybody here. Hine Am B'nai Israel. Behold, the nation of the children of Israel. Till now, we were the children of Israel, and then we're a nation. So there's a very significant point of transition. It's also a point of transition in the sense that the people who were born in Israel and are related to Israel, even though they're currently in Egypt, they're passing on. Jacob passes on. Joseph passes on and is buried and is placed in an ark in Egypt, and that's the conclusion of the first book. And then in the second book, next parsha, very quickly, the beginning of the second book of the Torah in Exodus, it says very quickly, Joseph and that entire generation dies. So in this generation, we're still talking about people who maybe they're in Egypt right now, because Vayechi begins the last 17 years of Jacob's life in Egypt, but at least they remember life in the land of Israel. Next book, we're talking about people who don't know what life in the land of Israel looks like. So that's a generational gap, a very significant generational gap. So this is a book of conclusion. This is a portion of conclusion and transition. And in some ways, transition from family to nation, transition from people who were related to the land of Israel, remember life in Israel, to people who were not. And I think that's the way you have to look at the parsha and think about what is really happening here. And what seems maybe like technical aspects of the story are really significant in the questions of transition. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
Two brief questions that you'll probably hit on in the hour or the 45 minutes. Number one, you often give us a one-line description of the five books. So I wonder if you might repeat those one-liners. And number two, this is the second portion in Genesis that the death of a patriarch or matriarch is talking about Chayei Sarah or Vayechi. And if we could go into John's territory and have a psychiatric evaluation, when Jacob is talking to Pharaoh, what would you think his analysis of his life would be? Happy, not happy?
Right. Very interesting. So that's this the last point is a separate subject, because he tells Pharaoh that his days are ma'at, few, and bad. And the Talmud, the Midrashim disagree whether or not that was whether or not to critique him. So he says it's bad, and what was he just? Yeah, so that's a discussion for itself, which I don't want to get into because I haven't read up on it recently.
Okay.
But if you want to talk about Chayei Sarah, so Chayei Sarah is interesting because that's the passing of Sarah, and in some ways, when are the Jewish people most vulnerable as a people, as a nation, as a story, as monotheism? The passing of the first generation is a very critical moment, right? So will the second generation carry on the legacy of the first generation? That is a very important question. That's a very important transition, and we don't know. In other words, the unknown is much greater first generation to second than second to third, because already we have a pattern. We have a pattern that, yes, generations pass and we can pass on the legacy, but we still do not have. But when Sarah passes away, and Sarah passes away. It's also, in a way, the end of the life of Abraham. We don't really hear much about Abraham after she passes away. Most of that story is about Eliezer and Isaac in that parsha. But it's a very vulnerable moment for the people, for the family, for the nation, call it what you want, because we have no experience in transitioning. You have a very charismatic leader, and you say, will the movement survive the leader? And there's always an unknown. And therefore, I think with Chayei Sarah, it's important to say Sarah is alive. Her legacy is alive, and that's proven specifically after she passes. Because in her lifetime, you say, yes, they're very charismatic, they're very hospitable, they know how to move around and influence people. But will that legacy continue after she passes? And there, the answer is yes. So we're very vulnerable at the first generation, the transition after the first generation. But we're also very vulnerable at the end of the book of Genesis, because it is now the transition. Again, we know that we can pass the legacy from generation to generation in the land of Israel, from Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, and even Jacob to his children, because maybe they're in Haran for a few years and they go back to Israel. The question is, and also they're related to their father who remembers his grandfather. The question is, now we're transitioning to a whole new situation. We're transitioning to a foreign country, to Egypt, and people don't remember the homeland. And could you then continue and keep the legacy alive? And that too is, again, a point of I would say wonder. We don't know. So there's uncertainty. And here too, the Torah says, Vayechi Yaakov, make no mistake, Jacob is alive. And the Talmud talks about it. The Talmud says, how can you say Jacob is alive? The Talmud says Jacob never died. So how can you say Jacob never died? Don't you read in the Torah at great length about his funeral and how they eulogized him and how they buried him? So the Talmud says, well, if his children are alive, he's alive. In other words, in some ways, the way you know that the person's legacy is alive is specifically if it's able to survive his physical life, then you know the person is truly alive. So I think that your point that comparing this to Chayei Sarah is true, because both those moments of transition are there's a lot of uncertainty, and the Torah therefore has to go out of its way to clarify. Yes, make no mistake, this is not a temporary thing. It's not just one generation, a couple, Abraham and Sarah, who are inspired, but this is something that could survive multiple generations. And then you get to the end of the book and you say, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim. That itself is the most amazing verse. Jacob is alive in Egypt. Jacob can bring life. Jacob could bring the concept of life not only to the homeland of Israel, to the Holy Land, but also to the foreign culture of Egypt, and also to his descendants who have never seen Israel and who are decades and in some cases centuries removed from Israel. So I think that comparison is true, and I think that both those points you could say Vayechi after every passing of anybody, certainly any one of the patriarchs. But I think that we specifically use that word when it's surprising, when we're not sure, there's uncertainty, and the Torah has to say that we have news here. We have news that Vayechi, the legacy, could survive. The person is still alive. The next generation is keeping the previous generation alive.
And to me, it sounds even more positive, more optimistic, in that Chayei Sarah is almost a passive historical reference of this is the life of Sarah. Vayechi is a present tense, Am Yisrael Chai kind of feeling to it. That's why when Pharaoh asked him about his life, it kind of rang pessimistic for me.
Yes.
And so somewhat confusing.
Yeah, so his life, he certainly saw his life as pessimistic in the sense that he definitely had the most sorrow and pain during his lifetime, right? Talking about running away from his family, he had to be in Haran for 20 years, and then the sale of Joseph. So he looks at himself and he says, I have a difficult life. What's interesting is, and there's a whole, this starts from the Baal HaTurim. The Baal HaTurim is a commentary on the Torah who, first of all, is more known for his halachic work, which is Arba Turim, the 4 columns. And people know that the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Law, is divided into 4 sections. And that follows the first person who divides the Torah and the law and organizes it into the 4 columns is the Baal HaTurim, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Asher. And he lived in the 14th century and maybe the 13th, I think the 14th. But he also wrote a book of commentary on the Torah. And on the Torah, so they call it Baal HaTurim, the author of the columns, meaning based on his halachic work, which is the Arba Turim, the 4 columns, and he is very into gematria, numerical value, and he says that's all over the Torah. That's his big thing. That's not his only thing, but it's his big thing. So when you read this parsha, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. Says the Baal HaTurim, 17 is the numerical value of tov, of good. The Hebrew word for tov is tes is 4. I'm sorry, tes is 9, vav is 6, and bet is 2. So 9, 6, 2 gets you to 17. So says the Baal HaTurim, 17 is the numerical value of tov, of good. So here's the irony. The irony is that Jacob has a very difficult life. That's what he tells Pharaoh. You assume he's saying the truth. In other words, he's not just saying it's a Pharaoh to be jealous. But let's assume that, let's presume that he had a very difficult life. So the commentaries say that the last years in Egypt were the good years, which is an irony. Specifically in Egypt, he has the good years. And here he has, his family is reunited. He's reunited with Joseph, and there's no sorrow. Everything is going good. I mean, we know the next generation things are going to turn bad, but in his own life, the irony is that he comes to Egypt and he says, I had a difficult life. And yet the Torah alludes to the fact that specifically in Egypt, he has tov, he has good. And the Hasidic commentaries talk about this at great length, and they say the true good is if you can have good in Egypt, if you could transform the negative circumstance and make that positive. So there's a whole essay that I have about that. We could get into that. But the point is that there's some irony here where Jacob's good life happens outside of Israel. And that's a broader conversation, which I always talk about because I think it's beautiful, but I don't want to get into it right now, so I'll be brief. And that is that we know that God tells Abraham that his descendants are going to be foreigners for 400 years. The problem is that according to most opinions, if you do the math, the Jewish people were only in Egypt for 210 years. So this is a problem that many of the sages have to address. And there's different genres of interpretation. One type of interpretation is, yes, indeed, God tells Abraham 400 years, but that 400 years never happened. It was actually the time has shrunk. Why has the time shrunk? Because of the intensity of the labor, because the Jewish people suffered so terribly. So, almost like it's almost like the quality or the intensity of the slavery makes the quantity reduced. In other words, the more quality,
it was compressed.
That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is, and this is from the Kli Yakar, he says no. He says, look, there were 400 years. But the question is, when do you start counting 400 years? When God says, Ger Yezaracha, your descendants are going to be foreigners, he doesn't say they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. He says they're going to be foreigners for 400 years. And then he says there'll be 400 foreigners for 400 years. And then, part of that 400-year period, they'll be enslaved and they'll be afflicted. But it doesn't mean they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. Says the Kli Yakar, the clock starts, well, other people say, it's safe to say it too, but you'll see what the Kli Yakar says in a minute. The clock starts ticking at the birth of Abraham's son, of Isaac. So if you count from the birth of Isaac to the Exodus, it's 400 years. Okay, beautiful. Then says the Kli Yakar, you look at Jacob's life, and you'll see that something interesting. Whenever he's in Israel, he has difficulties. Whenever he's outside of Israel, he flourishes. And the reason is, if he's going to be successful and at peace in Israel, then he's not a foreigner. If he's not a foreigner, if everything is perfect life in Israel, then the clock stops. Then it's delaying the Exodus because his descendants are not going to be, because the 400-year period is being pushed off because you need 400 years of being a ger, being a foreigner. But if he's outside of Israel, then he could be successful and in peace and have good years, because by virtue of being outside of Israel, he's already a ger. He's already a foreigner because he's outside of Israel. So that's how you think about that. That's why about his life, and Isaac is a different story. Isaac lived in Israel, but he was always a ger. He was always a foreigner. He wasn't a charismatic person, and he wasn't a person that people treated him as like they told his father, to see Elohim, you're a prince of God. Isaac did not have that relationship. So even when he lived in Israel, he was not in a state of ownership, so to speak. Maybe as an individual, he had an okay life. He had a good life, but he didn't have any position of authority. He was like, in a way, subjugated to the surrounding culture, to the surrounding tribes. So the point here is just addressing that concept that outside of Israel, Jacob flourishes, And that's so that's an important point, and we'll see how this ties into the broader point. What is the broader point? The broader point is if you look all throughout the parsha, if it's a moment of transition, if it's a time of transition, you want to also see the blueprint of how Jacob is telling his children or alluding to his children what is the secret of having life, of being alive, even in Egypt. And it's not that he's only giving the secret, but he's also celebrating that. And I'll show maybe 2 or 3 points, and then we'll talk about, and then we can see if we want to read it inside or not, or take a break because it's the new year. The first thing we hear about in the parsha, everybody knows this point, the big deal that Yaakov blesses his grandchildren, Menashe and Ephraim. And even before the story of, there's the point that he crosses his hands. Joseph has this whole thing where the oldest son has to sit under Jacob's right hand, and the second son has to sit under Jacob's left hand because right hand represents stronger blessing, and in that and the Bechor, the elderly, should get the greater blessing. And Jacob, in character, doesn't buy this hierarchy. He was the second one, and he stole his father's stole the brother's blessings. So Jacob crosses his hands and he puts his right hand on the younger one, on Ephraim, and Joseph is upset, and Jacob says, don't be upset. So that's another whole subject which we can get into. But beyond that, Jacob blesses his sons, his two grandsons, and he says a series of blessings. But one of the things he says is, through you, Israel will bless their children. Meaning, and may God make you like Menashe and like Ephraim and Menashe, which means Jacob says that if anybody will want to bless their children, you're not going to say, may God make you like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like the patriarchs. By the way, that's how you bless daughters. You want to bless daughters, you say, may God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. When it comes to sons, you don't say, may God make you like Menashe and we don't say that may God make you like the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but we say like Menashe and Ephraim, which is a big deal. That's fascinating. And in addition to that, he also says, Jacob says, I am adopting my 2 grandsons to be my sons. And in a way, it's a little bit sad that Joseph is no longer his own tribe. Joseph's tribe divides into 2. And you can read it in a positive way, in a negative way. If you want to read it in a positive way, let's start with the negative, then go to, okay, I don't know what to do first. You can read it in a positive way, and that is that in some ways, Jacob is the firstborn because he's Rachel's firstborn, and Rachel was the primary wife. In other words, the reason why Jacob thinks he's marrying Rachel, and he only gets married to the family. He wants Rachel. He doesn't want Leah. So he considers Joseph, his Bechor, his firstborn. Firstborn gets a double portion. Now, Joseph gets a double portion, Menashe and Ephraim. That's the positive way of looking at it. The negative way of looking at it is that Joseph, in a way, moves away from the family. He's the Egyptian monarch. In other words, Joseph didn't really live together with his father. He was mostly in the Egyptian culture. So Jacob can't say, Joseph, you're my son, because in addition to being my son, you have your own thing going. You are the leader of Egypt, but your grandchildren, they're mine. So in that sense, maybe it's either a celebration of Joseph or a rejection of Joseph, or not a rejection, or highlighting the idea that Joseph was somewhat distant. But without getting into that question, there's the question that Menashe and Ephraim are considered like Shvatim, like tribes. And why is that? The Torah does not say so explicit, but there's a beautiful commentary from the Rebbe. The Rebbe says like this. If you look at the verse says, now your 2 sons, which were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you to Egypt. Menashe and Ephraim, they're mine. They'll be like Reuven and Shimon. Now, you could look at that verse and say that verse is descriptive. You want to say, which sons? The ones that were born before I came, Menashe and Ephraim. Meaning, if you'll have other sons, they're not going to be considered tribes. They're not going to be considered the sons of Jacob. Or the Rebbe's interpretation is, that is the reason. That is the reason why are Menashe and Ephraim considered tribes? Because they were born in Egypt before Jacob comes. In other words, here we have the model of 2 sons alone, away from the rest of the family, and they're born in Egypt, which is a foreign to the holy land, and yet they remain loyal to Jacob. So that's the reason why they're considered tribes because we need that. Jacob says we need that ability. We have to celebrate that ability to be able to carry Judaism and the Jewish family and the Jewish legacy to even in a place where there's no other Jewish people there. And it's not the homeland, and it's not even the place where the family is. You're there alone. And that is the blessing. The blessing is that you could be a Jew wherever you are, and you're not influenced by your surroundings. To the contrary, you influence the surrounding. And that's what Jacob is so inspired by. And that's why he says, I need to include them in my family. These people are critical to the Jewish story because we're in a time of transition. Not only it's going to Egypt, but Jewish history. For most of our history, we were not in the land of Egypt, in the land of Israel. So when you want to bless your son, the best thing you could say is be like Menashe and Ephraim. You have the ability to bring Judaism to a place that it wasn't here before, even if you were one person alone, because you could be like Menashe and Ephraim and you would influence her and you're not influenced. So that's one point where you see this, where you see Jacob is thinking about the transition, thinking about how are we going to continue this legacy when I'm not here, when the Jewish people are separate from Israel for a very long time. And the model he chooses, the model he sees, the model he celebrates is Menashe and Ephraim. So that's one point. And I want to say one more point, and then we'll see if we're going to go further. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. You mentioned influencer, and this is what we all strive for because we don't live in most of our audience don't live in Israel. But who was the influencer? Was it Joseph or the sons? Because if not for Joseph's influence, they wouldn't grow up the way they grew up.
Correct. But Joseph is still a first generation immigrant. So Joseph still remembers the land of Israel. It's not surprising that Joseph is keeping his past alive, right? The first generation immigrant, that's what you're going to do. But to be able to convey that to the next generation, even if Joseph wants to do it, it's the choice of the next generation. They could have assimilated into Egypt, no problem. And they didn't have memories from their grandfather to sort of force that or sort of to influence them. This is their own making, right? You see when new immigrants come to a new country, the first generation, I don't know where you start counting. I think the immigrant himself is the first generation. Who knows? The point is that if people came from the old country, from a different country, so it's clear that they're going to keep their traditions alive. But will the next generation hang on to it? That is something that's entirely in their hands. Because in a way, the next generation have more opportunity than the first generation. They know how they're natives. They don't need, they're natives. They have their own. They could integrate much better. And so Joseph himself always remembers his youth, remembers his father. So of course, yes, he's an influencer. Of course, I'm not taking away anything from him. But I'm saying to be able to do that, for the next generation to do that, that is something that Jacob was inspired by even more than Joseph. He was inspired by Joseph too. He was inspired by Joseph too. We read about that last week, that he could be alive and he could influence. He could remain loyal to the legacy and influence while being integrated into Egyptian culture. That's an amazing thing. Joseph is amazing, and the children get it from their father. But nevertheless, for the second generation to be able to do so, there's something here that they're doing on their own, and there's something here that no one has ever seen. That remember, today we know we can carry Judaism in all different types of places in the world, from every corner of the world. But think about that first time. Joseph himself was raised by Jacob. Okay, very nice. Here, these sons, they're born in Egypt, and the father is the Egyptian monarch. They could have gone to the best schools. They could have done whatever they wanted. So Jacob is amazed. Jacob is amazed even more. Jacob is even more amazed by his grandsons than by his son. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, that's beautiful. But also you have to, in addition to Joseph, we have to give credit to Jacob because he was there for 17 years, influencing the grandsons as well.
But he says, Reuben and Shimon that were born to you before I came here. He was more amazed about he was, of course, he took here. It says later, of course, what he was amazed is at when he showed up, the grandchildren he saw how they were raised before he met them. That's what he was blown away by.
Yeah, but maybe that was a part of it, like a prophecy, because he saw the potential in them to stay strong in their beliefs, even in the face of different.
Perfect. And he says you have to bottle this and give this to every Jew. And every Jew, people, I don't know which customs, Chabad only does it once a year, but other people do it every Friday night. I'm not sure what the Sfardim do, but the bottom line is that people, this is a blessing people say on a regular basis. It's printed in every prayer book, right? That we want to bottle this idea of Menashe and Ephraim and say, may God make you like Menashe and Ephraim. And what is that ability? Think about it. What is unique about Menashe and Ephraim? So the Rebbe's interpretation, what's unique about them is they're born away from the rest of the family, away from the grandfather, and yet they have the ability to remain loyal and carry the legacy and expand the legacy. And in some ways, Jacob is fascinated by that. He's I don't know what the right word is in the thesaurus here, but he celebrates this, and he says everybody should be talking about this, and we should be celebrating this, and we should think about this and telling it to our children, telling these stories to our children, because that's the skill we need. If we're to survive, if we're to be alive today in 2026, it's only because the Jewish people had a quality of Menashe and Ephraim.
That's beautiful. So he kind of predicted that, and we have to live his legacy in a way that he predicted.
Yes.
Because most of us are not in Israel.
Right.
And subjected to all kind of different influences.
Yes. Even if you're in Israel, there's the physical Israel and the spiritual Israel. You can drive down in Tel Aviv in the Ayalon and you think you're in either Miami or in Manhattan in the summer. In other words, there's a lot of cultural influences in Israel that are not loyal to Israel. So there's being in the physical Israel, which is important. There's also being in the spiritual Israel. Okay, let's say one more thing, because this is I think is interesting. And if you look at, maybe I'll be brief, but if you look at there's a lot. It's a little bit morbid. I'm trying to write an email, so I'm trying to figure out how do I make a title about funerals without making it sad. There's a lot about funerals. So just to be very, very brief here, there's two funerals in this parsha. There's the passing of Jacob and there's the passing of Joseph. And there's a difference between them. And the contrast is very clear. It looks like the Torah is going out of its way to highlight the contrast. What is that? Right in the beginning of the parasha, Jacob makes his son Joseph swear, says, take me out of Egypt. I do not want to be buried here. Carry me up, bring me back to Israel, to the cave of Machpelah. And Joseph says, I'm going to do so. And Jacob says, no, that's not enough. You have to swear. And he swears. And then you read about the funeral itself, and you have all this great detailed description of how they carry from Egypt and how they come to Israel and how the Canaanites, everybody is mourning. It's the whole funeral procession. There's so many verses about the funeral. Okay, that's Jacob. Then you have Joseph's passing. What is Joseph's passing? Joseph's passing is in a way very morbid. He's placed in the ark in Egypt. He doesn't want to be in Egypt. He also wants to go to Israel. So he makes his brother swear. He says, he makes them swear that when you leave Egypt, God will remember you eventually. And when you leave Egypt, take my bones with you as well. So he also wants to go back to Israel. And eventually he's buried in Israel, in Shechem, but that's another story. The point here is that right now he's buried in Egypt. He's placed in Egypt. And the final verse of the book of Exodus is, Joseph dies 110 years, and he's placed in the ark in Egypt. Now, that's not the most inspiring way to end the verse. The Rebbe talked about this, and the Rebbe said what the Torah could have done is switch the last verse and the second to last verse, because the second to last verse is very uplifting. He says, God will surely remember you, and you'll bring my bones up from here. And you could have had Joseph was placed in the ark first, and then what he told his brothers to make them swear. But the Torah is concluding, and the Torah is saying that the final verse, the climax of the Torah is what? Of the book of Genesis, Joseph is placed in the ark in Egypt. And that's very different than Jacob. Jacob goes back to Israel, and Joseph, at least for the time being, is in Egypt. So this is something you want to think about, because it looks like the Torah is sort of drawing your attention to this contrast and saying, this is an important story, and we're going to finish the first book by having this dichotomy. I think this is how we think about how you could be like Menashe and Ephraim, how you can remain loyal to Judaism, even if you're in a distant place, by following this model of being Jacob and Joseph. So let's think about this briefly. How do you solve a problem? Or how do you give somebody advice? Or how do you give yourself advice? So like this. If you're above the problem, you can't solve it. Your kid comes to you and says, I have a problem in school, and my friend told me something, and my teacher told me something else. If you don't care about this and you don't empathize with the problem, and the problem doesn't bother you, and you're just above it, you cannot put yourself in the shoes of this child or this person, and you can't give them advice because you're removed from their scenario. So you don't know what their struggles are. You don't know what the tension is. So you cannot solve somebody else's problem, or you can't offer them advice, or you can't try to help anything if the problem doesn't bother you. On the other hand, so you can't be above the problem. On the other hand, if you're in the problem, then you can't solve it either. Because the Talmud says that, for example, in chavush matir tatzmo, someone who's in prison cannot untie them. Someone who's tied up cannot untie themselves, right? If someone else is tied up, why do you come to someone else for advice? Because you feel tied up, I feel tied up. Now, I could be stronger than you, but if I'm tied up, I need someone else to untie the bonds. I could be stronger than the other person, but if I'm tied, if I'm suffering from this problem, I can't undo it. Someone else who is not suffering from the problem could see this straight and give me advice or help me or untie me. So what I'm trying to get at is to really be able to overcome a challenge. On one hand, you have to understand the challenge, and it has to bother you, and you have to understand it and feel it. On the other hand, you have to realize that you're above it. It doesn't define you. Because if you think this challenge defines you, you're trapped and you can't untie yourself. You can't untie the other person, you can't untie yourself. What am I saying? You have to be within it, but above it as well. You have to say, there is a challenge, I understand it, I understand the problem, I understand the constraints, I understand the pressures, but those pressures don't define me. I'm above that as well. And only if you can be in it and above it together could you solve the problem. And if you think about this, this is really what's happening with the two burials. The Jew has to realize, the Jew hears the story, and they say, where's Grandpa? Grandpa, he's not buried in Egypt. Grandpa is buried in Israel. Meaning, our place, this is not our place. We're going to be enslaved, but we're not slaves. We have our own story. What's our story? We're from Israel. How do you know we're from Israel? Because Grandpa is buried in Israel. And you remember the whole story, how he made us promise it will take us back from Israel. And we've had a funeral procession, and we went back to Israel. And we're talking, all this energy that Torah puts into describing the funeral is basically telling the kids and the grandkids, this is not your place. Egypt is not your place. Your place is Israel. You're above the problem. On the other hand, if Jacob was above the problem, so he never experienced the slavery, he's above the problem. How does he help us? He doesn't help us. We're in the problem. So here you have Joseph. What's Joseph? Joseph is in the problem. Joseph is from Egypt. He's part of their culture. And the fact that the Torah concludes and says Joseph is buried in or placed, at least temporarily, in Egypt means Joseph understands Egypt. He's part of Egypt. He's not above Egypt. And we have both of those. On one hand, we're from Israel. On one hand, we're in Egypt. As a people, we're from Israel, but we're also very much present in the diaspora. And if you want to talk spiritually, as the Hasidic masters do, the soul entering the body, the soul coming into life on this earth. Life on this earth with its challenges, its spiritual challenges and physical challenges, but also spiritual challenges. So we have this, on one hand, you say the soul is very much invested in the body, in life in the body. And you can't say that if there's a problem in the body, the soul doesn't care. Of course the soul cares. On the other hand, the soul has its own identity. What is my true identity? My true identity is I'm a spiritual being. So on one hand, I'm a spiritual being. On the other hand, I'm invested in the physical world. And only if you have both those elements of being present, but also being transcendent, only then could you survive as a soul in this body. Could you survive as a Jew in the diaspora? And that's alluded to with these two funerals, with these two ideas. On one hand, Jacob is above Egypt. Part of us is above Egypt, and part of us is very much invested within Egypt. And that's the Jacob-Joseph model. And we must have both, because if we had one, we would, and without the other, we wouldn't be able to be both soul in the body, Jew in the diaspora. We would lose one or the other. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
So bring this back to Chabad and its mission statement. Is this a corollary to people who make Aliyah? You're being invested so much in the diaspora. Is it as the opposite side of a magnet?
It's what the Hasidim say, that you have to, what there's the Hasidic saying, going back to the third Chabad Rebbe, when we say we're in the diaspora, the point is not to be in the diaspora. The point is to say, make Israel here. In other words, to be a foot in both places, to have a foot in both cultures. We believe that the exile is not just, it's not just we, but it's based on the Medrash and the Kabbalah. But the exile is not just a punishment for sins, but there's a spiritual mission to be scattered throughout the world and elevate the sparks and bring holiness to every corner of the world. But when you do so, that's the question. Am I a person from Israel who is in Greenwich, or am I a person from Greenwich who's in Israel? Person from Greenwich. In other words, what's your identity? So yeah, the idea is not to be in the diaspora. The idea is to be in the diaspora knowing that your grandfather is in Israel and eventually you're going back to Israel. So in other words, you're here and you're not here at the same time.
And the Rebbe made it a point never to go to Israel, right?
Correct, because we're not exactly sure why, but there's also a problem with if you go to Israel, there's halachic problems with leaving Israel. Leaving Israel is a problem. Could be that's what it was. We're not exactly sure, but if I had to guess, that's what I would say. But nobody spoke about going back to Israel more than the Rebbe. The Rebbe was, in his words, crazy about Mashiach, always talking about Mashiach is going to come and then we're going to go back to Israel. So never allow yourself to forget that we're not really from Egypt. Even Joseph, who represents the model of being in Egypt, he was not buried in Egypt. He's placed in an ark in Egypt. And an ark means I'm still on the go, I'm still on the journey. But my journey is going to bring me back to Israel. But the way to do that, you have to have, if you really want to influence the world, you have to be in the world and you have to be above the world. It's very easy to be an angel, very easy to say, I happen to be living in America, but I'm in my own world. So I don't speak English. I don't understand the culture, and I'm not trying to communicate with the culture. I'm in my shtetl, I'm in my ghetto. It could have been in Prague, it could have been in Williamsburg. It doesn't really matter where I am because I'm not really here. That's the model of Jacob. Jacob was not really in Egypt. Even when he was in Egypt, he was in Goshen, which is a separate region, which was very different. It was the region for raising cattle, which none of the Egyptians did. So I'm saying you could be in a place and be removed. And in that sense, okay, so you're preserving who you are, but you're not in communication with the culture. On the other hand, if you're in the culture and you think this is your place, then over time you're going to become integrated to the sense that you forget where you come from. So the point is, the model of the portion of what Vayechi is representing, how do you keep Judaism alive, is both Jacob and Joseph model, not one or the other. You have to be above and be within. And just to conclude, I heard this from a person that I know. Now he goes to Chabad of New Canaan, and a very sad story. He went to work and then he came home, and his wife passed away, and she was young and healthy. I mean, she was young and healthy, but so he was like, obviously it was very difficult for him, but he told me at the Shiva, that the night before he took a JLI class, and he was so inspired by the class. And on the train in the morning, he was so inspired that he told the person next to him, complete stranger, he said, "You don't know what I learned last night." And he said, "What did you learn last night?" He said, "Every person has to ask myself," he says, "Am I a body with a soul, or am I a soul with a body?" And he was just so amazed, because that night when he came home and he saw his wife passed, and he's trying to think what is life and what is she, and she's a soul. So he was amazed that God sort of sent him to that class, and he was able to think about these questions before she actually passed. And the point was, that's the question: Am I a physical being? Am I a physical being with some spirituality, or am I a spiritual being with some physical? And the answer is I'm both. But sometimes I'm more Joseph, sometimes I'm more Jacob. But I'm not one or the other. If I'm one or the other, then I'm not in the story of bringing life to Egypt. I'm not in the story of transforming Egypt to 17 years to Tov, to good. Because to be able to solve the problem, you have to be both in the problem and above the problem. And I think that's what this portion of Vayechi, the middle is the blessings, but I'm just saying there's so much about the burials. And as a kid, it was like, this is like, why do I really care about the funeral procession? It's not that interesting. But the truth is, it's very interesting, because this contrast between Jacob and Joseph is what's allowing us and teaching us how to be in both those spaces at the same time. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
A beautiful message. Thank you so much. And it also gives us strength to understand that we can, and also hope that we are able to pass it down to next generation because of Jacob's prophecy. So we blessing our children in the hope that, as you said, that there is a spiritual exile and there is a physical exile, and there is also soul and a body. So that gives us strength to pass down this message to the next generation when we bless our children. That's beautiful. Thank you.
So I think if they're Menashe and Ephraim, then you're Jacob, right?
We're trying to be. We're trying to.
Yeah.
It's so amazing how often this recurring theme comes up, and it's funny that in the Bible there's so many pairs, Esau and Jacob, Ishmael and Isaac. I mean, it's the recurring theme of the upstairs and the downstairs, and how life is trying to bring these two things together, never negating the other. I mean, you need both in terms of finding the true one.
Yes.
And it just comes up in Tanya, and it comes up in Haftorot, and it comes up. It seems like every other week you're mentioning the upstairs and the downstairs.
And I would just say that you want to be poetic and you want to circle back to the beginning of the book and the end of the book. What's the opening statement of the Torah? The opening statement of Genesis. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Et hashamayim et haaretz. Heaven and earth. And then what is the human being? The human being is the hybrid of heaven and earth, because the body is from the earth and the soul is from God. Every other creation is either heaven or earth. If you look about the 6 days of creation, every creation is either heaven or earth. And the human being is the hybrid. And how are you a hybrid of heaven and earth? How could you compare? How could you bring together these two extremes? And the answer is, you're not compromising. You're not meeting in the middle. You're in both. You're both heaven and earth. And therefore, the human being, if you think about this, the human being in some ways is the most. He's not meeting in middle. He's the most earthly, the most antithetical to holiness in a way, because the human being is the only creature that can go against the will of God. The animal can't go against the will of God. The animal follows its instincts. Its instincts is what God wants of it. Only the human being has free choice and go against the will of God. So in some ways, the human being is the most earthly, but the human being is also the most in heaven, because we spoke about this in Tanya. God blows his life, not a soul of life, into his nostrils. And we talked about in Tanya chapter 2 that blowing, the whole world is created through speech. Speech is external, much more external than blowing. When you blow, you're blowing from within. So the human being is really the hybrid of these two extremes. He's in two places. And that's when we look at ourselves and we say, what's going on? On one hand, we're so transcendent. On the other hand, we're so physical. And in some ways, even more than animals. Animals don't go around creating, don't do evil like what humans do. But we are the heaven and the earth. We're the hybrid of heaven and earth. And the way you do it is being a foot in both places. And if you think I'm only a creature of heaven, you're not going to influence the physical earth. And if you only think of a creature of earth, then you're not connecting heaven and earth. You're not bringing heaven down to earth.
It's Hashem's human experiment. And you would think that in terms of the process or the end, Hashem enjoys the process. So the idea of Mashiach probably will never come, only because the human experiment will be over.
Right. In a way, that's right. But on the other hand, there's the way of celebrating what we've done. Because when you talk about what's Mashiach, Isaiah says, we're not going to become angels, but v'ro kol basar yachdav, all flesh will see that it's the word of God has spoke. So you'll see the true fusion of body and soul happens in the Messianic era. But even then, it's not that we're angels. There is an economy, and there is a culture, and there is abundance, and there is, like Maimonides says, even though people are just all they're going to want to do is knowledge of God, but there's going to be an era of plenty and no scarcity. So in other words, our vision of Messianic era is not a vision of angels and souls. It's a vision of life on earth, but it's a life that's connected to holiness in a way that we don't have right now. So even the Messianic era is not about becoming angels. That's Olam Haba. That's the world to come. The world to come, where the soul goes after the world after the passing, is just a spiritual existence. But that's not the ultimate. The ultimate is, and that's why resurrection of the dead is an important principle in Judaism, one of the 13 principles. Now, exactly how it's going to happen, I don't know. I'm not an expert. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But the point is the idea that the goal is not to be a soul. The goal is not to be an angel. The goal is to have body and soul, either the way it is now, where there's tension and there's a challenge, or in the way that's going to be the Messianic era, where there's going to be unity. But the unity still means there's still body and soul. There's still physical and spiritual. It's just that
And
the
there'll
physical and
still be a
spiritual create a
tension.
harmony. Go ahead.
There'll still be a tension.
I wouldn't say tension, but harmony. Harmony is different voices singing together and makes it more beautiful, right? So right now we have the body and soul. It's like a choir with harmony, but the guy has no idea how to harmonize. So the body is screaming one song, the soul is screaming another song, and there's tension. But the ultimate is not to eliminate the differences between body and soul. You're going to have the body and soul, but body and soul are not going to be at war. They're going to be creating a harmony, but it's still heaven and earth. It's still body and soul. In a way, it's like Shabbat. If you think about it, the Gemara says Shabbat is me'ein olam haba. Shabbat is a taste of the world to come. What is Shabbat? Shabbat is not a time. It's not Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is we don't eat, we don't drink. We're like angels. Shabbat, it's a mitzvah to honor Shabbat with food and drink. So on Shabbat, you get a little bit about this. We're eating the pleasurable food on Shabbat is itself a spiritual service. Now, because Mashiach didn't come yet, it's possible that a person could eat on Shabbat, eat the chalent or eat the chamin or whatever you call it, and not be connected to holiness. But so it's not the ultimate, but it's a taste of redemption. You could be in a space that Shabbat, eating on Shabbat is a spiritual experience. So it's not that we want to become souls. It's like Shabbat. We want to have body. We want to connect the body and the soul and create that harmony. But it's not the blurring or it's not, none of them lose their own identity. Each has its own identity, but they're not in conflict anymore. It's harmony.
Beautiful.
Okay, everyone should have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbat and a wonderful year. And like they say, we're going to say it tomorrow. Chazak, chazak, chazek, be strong, may we be strengthened. Go ahead, Vicky. You get the last word.
Well, my word was Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom and Shabbat is again like redemption. Shabbat is like being in both worlds. We're experiencing the delight of the soul and the delight of Hashem, but we're also connecting it to the delight of the body.
Amen.
Amen.
Shabbat Shalom.
Chazak Baruch.
Thank you all for joining.